Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and the bin that I want to check in on today is the one that you see here on the bench. It's at this point reached 189 days of age, which is the same as 27 weeks. And the last time we checked in here, 1 week ago, we had restored these plastic coverings. Up until that time, we had been leaving it uncovered to try to allow for the evaporation of excess moisture from the bin, because for a while we had found the material to be just a little bit too wet and sticky and clumpy. But last week we went ahead and we took that drier material that was collecting on the surface, that had had time to dry off and evaporate, and we started together with the more damp material underneath, and we started seeing that the material did seem to have a pretty good average consistency to it. However, some of those harder chunks that we stirred in off of the top surface did seem like they might need a little bit of time to absorb a little bit of moisture into themselves, to soften up, to become a little bit more crumbly. So you can see I got a little bit of a checklist here of things I'd like to check in on here today. So number one was that moisture level, to see if in fact the more damp material had in fact handed off some of its moisture to the more dry material. And I think that the next bullet is really the telltale as to whether or not we've reached the right moisture level, which is just an examination of how the material itself feels and how it reacts to being handled. And if it's all nice and loose and crumbly and none of it really tends to stick to itself, then at that point I think we're going to consider that as the ideal state of the material. So I am really hoping that between those two measures that we've got material that's not overly damp, not overly clumpy, nice and loose. And as long as we've got that first thing achieved within this bin, then there's just a couple other considerations to be taken into account, which means if the material itself is already the way we want it, the only other remaining factor is whether it's still got worms in it or not. And if there are still worms in the material, then we will probably want to leave a little bit more time for them to migrate out of the castings before we can just collect the castings and consider this as a finished bin. And then hand in hand with the migration of the worms is the food supply that's been placed in there to try to lure the worms out of the finished castings so that they can be rounded up and removed from the container, relocated into a new home. So I don't know what to expect. It's been a week now since we last checked in, and these plastic covers have been on here for that past week consistently. I've not had a chance to peek in here or check how things are progressing. But right off the bat, you could see a good amount of moisture collecting on the plastic and allowing it to drop right back down onto the feeding zone. Feeding zone was not only covered with that plastic, but a couple sheets of paper as well. And the material in general out here is also covered with plastic, so that no further evaporation of the material would occur. Because our hope was that by this time, some of the more dry, clumpy things that had been stirred into the material would have absorbed some of the moisture from the more damp stuff, and that by now, hopefully, we'd have a material that's nice and consistent, just the way we want it. So I'm going to put a glove on so we could do a hands-on examination of this stuff to see how it's progressing. And in addition to examining the material itself, we're also going to take a look at how things are looking here in the feeding area too, which is attempting to migrate worms out of the finished castings and lure them over to this side of the container. This looks to me like a worm cocoon. We'll just drop it in there with where the rest of the worms are supposed to be. So let's go ahead and remove this covering as well. Try to make sure we don't have any hitchhikers on board. Although the material is damp enough that we shouldn't have to worry too much about worms being stuck on the paper. They should do fine for the few minutes that we're going to have this whole setup exposed to the air. So let's get to work. So it was these larger chunks of material that were rock hard and really not even such that you can crumble them. And out here on the very perimeter, maybe we don't have the type of rehydration of those types of chunks as we had hoped for. But here in the middle, where the moisture had been circulating nicely, these sort of larger chunks that had been on the surface previously and had dried out so much that they were like little boulders and rocks, couldn't even be broken, are now soft enough to actually crumble away in your hands, which is pretty cool. It's kind of what you're after. So here we've still got some dry stuff which will get mixed in with the rest of the more damp material beneath it. So I'm going to just start trying to determine that cutoff point. And if I do encounter a worm, that'll tell me that I've actually now gotten into the feeding zone section, the horizontal migration feeding zone. And it does look like I've got pretty much castings only, even right here on the very edge, which is normally where you would kind of still see sort of a feathering off of worm population. You would definitely expect to see the majority of them in where the bulk of the food in the bin is, if not all of the food in the bin. But in this case, it does seem like nearly all of the worms are in fact in the feeding zone. Or maybe I just didn't check close enough, but we are at this point right on the edge where I am starting to now see a number of worms right on that very perimeter. And that's starting to give me kind of a pretty good, hopeful sense that everything else over on this side is probably at this point more or less depopulated, if not entirely depopulated. So it does seem like we've more or less found the border between what we would consider to be the finished castings in this bin and what we would consider to be the migration zone over here with the worms in it. And this stuff with the worms in it definitely has like a nice loose feeling to it. But we'll poke around in there in a moment just to see how things look. I'm more curious to see if our observations are in fact true, that maybe we've actually got a completely depopulated batch of vermicompost here. It did seem a week ago that we were getting pretty close to that already, because when we were stirring the material around and looking through it, I did notice a worm or two, but not many at all. Certainly not many at all. And I suppose if we were to stumble on one or two now, that wouldn't really be an indication that we need to prolong the migration. I am starting to sense that this is in fact the end of the horizontal migration, and that this material has been depopulated of worms. I am finding multiple chunks that had been stirred down into the material, which last week were still almost rock hard because they were the chunks that had been out on the surface while the material was uncovered and exposed to the air. And this material had just been so tough that you never would have been able to break it apart this way in your hands. But now it's really starting to become nice and loose and crumbly. It does require a little bit of effort between my fingers to break it apart, but certainly not much at all. And that really was the whole idea of keeping the material covered with plastic for the past week, was to sort of allow for the equalization of the moisture within the finished compost. Allowing just a little bit more time to give the stuff in here that was just a little bit too damp still to share its moisture with the really dry stuff that had been sitting out on the top surface, so that we could reach this point where those larger, drier chunks could now be fragmented into smaller little pieces. And at the same time, the more damp material would become less clumpy and less sticky, and then we would end up with the nice consistent material throughout the bin. So I definitely like what I'm seeing here. Very nice finished castings. Uh-oh, look at this. We did find one straggler worm. Oops, sorry buddy. Let's move them over. And it makes me wonder if we're going to encounter any more, but we've been doing a pretty good job stirring this stuff around at this point. Oh, guess what? I just found another one. Makes me wonder if all the way out here on the far reaches of the bin, at the furthest extent of the bin opposite of where the feeding zone had been set up, maybe the worms just didn't sense that there was a better place within the bin to try to gravitate towards. So maybe they were simply oblivious to the fact that they could go over there and find a whole bounty of food, as well as all of their brothers and sisters over there, all hanging out having a big party. They were probably wondering, hey, what happened? Everyone cleared out. They were probably enjoying the solitude of having all of this material to themselves. But you really got to admit, finding 2 or 3 worms is really an anomaly at this point, because this material is clearly depopulated at this point. Naturally, if you were really interested in coming up with some material that was extra fine and truly devoid of any little fragments, any little sticks and stems that you might still see in here, or any other little scraps of uncomposted bedding or other material, then you would always have that option to sift the material through a screen, and that would exclude any larger chunks, any pieces that are not broken down yet, little pieces of wood and sticks. But if you're just a hobbyist like I am, if you're not looking to create material that's almost perfect that could be sold, then chances are you're probably going to be satisfied with a material that's this consistency. And it could pretty much go straight out to the garden and let your plants start benefiting from it. It's pretty cool. So I have this plastic container here, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to extract what we've managed to assemble here as far as the worm population that we've migrated from our finished castings. And then we can get a closer look at what we ended up with. Granted, there is a fair bit of uncomposted food left in here for sure, as well as some bedding materials, some cardboard, some leafy bits. I'm going to migrate these worms to their new home, together with the material that they inhabit presently, as well as some of these larger food bits that have been going along for the ride with them, like that mango seed, as well as any other larger food bits that are in here. And if you've been following the series, then you'll also know that there's a jumble of human hair within this pile of worms and castings and bedding and everything else. But I believe the time has come to officially abandon our tracking of that little jumble of human hair because this bin is done. We've now got our final extractions of worms in this plastic tub here, along with a whole bunch of nice castings that they've created while they were in here feeding on the food that had been set up to bait them out of the finished castings. And together with all that material, they're going to be relocated into the newest of my bins, which is still a fairly new bin. It's only a couple weeks old, and there are already a couple thousand worms in there. And I would have to estimate that what we've pulled out here is probably about another 1,000 or so worms, but it's very difficult to tell because there is a whole bunch of bedding and finished castings and residual food bits in here. So it's just going to be a rough estimate of perhaps one more 1,000 worms being added to my newest worm bin. So here we have it. Here's our finished castings. I don't really feel like there's a whole lot to do in terms of, you know, showing what happens with this next, because it really just goes into a bucket. I just place it into a bucket until such a time that I need to use it. And I'll take care of that off camera. That's not so interesting. I think what's more interesting is getting these little guys launched off into their new quarters. So I'm going to go ahead and get the newest of my bins out here on the bench so we can release these guys and let them get acclimated to their new home. Hey Siri, how many days have passed since July 28th?
Just a sec. It was 15 days ago.
Alright, so we've got ourselves a 15-day-old worm bin, and this is interesting to see. Looks like I've got a little spider here protecting my bin from flying insects. Thanks, buddy, I appreciate that. Looks like he's also got a little welcoming party out here. Alright, so now that we've got our little spider friend and our worm friend off of our plastic and cardboard covering, I believe we can proceed to releasing our worms. Just make sure we don't have any hitchhikers here on this plastic either. So you can see some worms hanging out here. It's been a couple days since this bin was last fed, so I'm already starting to see signs of the level in the middle where the last feeding occurred dropping down. This coffee filter was intended to show where the last feeding had been applied. Just going to make sure we don't have any little guys hanging out on here either. I've already removed my glove thinking that there wasn't going to be any more dirty work remaining here. So I'll just have to wash up later. So here we go. We're relocating the worms that just did a really awesome job over the past half a year, breaking down the contents of our composting bin, and now they're being cut loose on a new space to continue their hard work. So here we go. Let's let them go. Oh, only one left. Good job. So I'm just going to use this stick here to try to break up the chunky material here so we can get a better view of our last batch of worms that we migrated out of our material, partially to get a sense of how many we've actually managed to round up in this last wave, because I am trying to keep tabs on how many worms I'm releasing into each of my newest bins. Kind of a new thing I'm trying. So I believe that my estimate from earlier, which was somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 1,000 worms, does seem realistic based on what I just saw here. May have even been more. So I'd love to hear people's thoughts on what they think. How many worms did we just release here into this new bin of mine? So let's give these little guys a few minutes to settle down into their new space, get acclimated, and then we're done. All right, well, I believe that's it. We've come to the finish line. We've got ourselves another batch of worms that have made their way through a single bin, taking that bin from start to finish, and now they're getting started in a new location to continue their good work. So that was really exciting. I've never really tried that before. I never really tried creating an entire series of videos all focused on just a single bin and observing its creation, its population, its upkeep, and ultimately its harvesting and migration of its worms. I really enjoyed it. It was very interesting to be able to really focus and pinpoint our energies onto a single bin, track all of the information about it, manage its needs, its requirements, and try to steer it towards a successful finish. And I believe we've done just that here. So hopefully you found it just as interesting as I did. Independently. So if you've just stumbled on this video and you're interested in actually seeing the entire playlist that tracks the progress of the bin from start to finish, I'm going to go ahead and I'll put a link to it. I'll put the link right up here in the corner, and you could click on that. It'll take you right to the playlist where you can track the progress of the bin from start to finish, and that'll include this video as well. But I think we're done here, and it's a great job, good job done, and I appreciate everyone's company. I feel like I've learned a lot from hearing people's thoughts and ideas in the comments, and I'm always open to new suggestions and ideas. So if you do have any questions or comments, be sure to enter them below into the comments section. As always, please be sure to give me a thumbs up and a like if you enjoyed the video. I really hope you did. And also consider subscribing to the channel too. All you got to do is hit that red subscribe button. Also be sure to ring the bell. This way YouTube will notify you of new videos on my channel. And then hopefully we'll see you back here next time. Alright everyone, thanks again for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.